Beneath the dry wind of central Anatolia, the ground gives the impression of silence that has lasted for millennia. Rolling plains stretch outward in muted browns and greys, broken only by low hills that seem unremarkable at first glance. Yet beneath these hills lies something that should not exist in the historical record as it is currently understood. Stone foundations, massive and deliberately arranged, appear in fragments when the soil is cut by modern excavation. The deeper the digging goes, the less the site resembles a simple ancient settlement, and the more it begins to suggest something far larger, more coordinated, and far more advanced than the region was ever believed to have supported in that era. The first excavators expect nothing unusual. The landscape has been occupied for thousands of years by successive layers of human habitation, and most discoveries in the region fit comfortably within known patterns of early agriculture and village life. But the stonework emerging from the soil does not match those expectations. The blocks are too large, too precisely shaped, and too deliberately positioned to belong to a small agrarian community. Even more unsettling is the absence of clear continuity with later cultural layers. It is as if the builders belonged to a civilization that appeared fully formed and then vanished without leaving a developmental trace. As excavation expands, carved markings begin to appear on upright stones. These inscriptions are not decorative in a simple sense. They follow structured patterns, repeated symbols, and organized sequences that suggest language rather than ornamentation. Yet they do not correspond to any known script from surrounding ancient cultures. Linguists who first examine the markings hesitate to assign them a place in established linguistic families. The shapes carry echoes of familiarity, but refuse to resolve into anything recognizable. This tension between resemblance and total alienation becomes one of the earliest clues that something fundamental is missing from the historical map of the ancient world. What makes the discovery more unsettling is not only what is present, but what is absent. There are no gradual architectural precursors in nearby layers that would explain how such construction techniques developed locally. No intermediate stages of experimentation, no transitional forms of stonework, no evidence of a slow progression from simple to complex building methods. Instead, the site appears abruptly in the archaeological record, fully formed and structurally sophisticated. Scholars still debate how to interpret such a phenomenon, because it disrupts the expectation that civilizations evolve in visible, traceable steps. Early interpretations attempt to fit the site into known regional cultures. Some propose that it belongs to a forgotten branch of early Anatolian communities. Others suggest it may be a ritual centre rather than a settlement, built by mobile groups who left few permanent traces. But neither explanation fully accounts for the scale of construction or the complexity of the symbolic system carved into the stones. Possibility begins to emerge that the site is not an isolated anomaly, but a fragment of something much larger that has yet to be identified. As the excavation continues, patterns start to repeat across multiple stones, hinting at coordinated planning across a wide area. The arrangement of structures suggests intentional spatial design, possibly aligned with astronomical or environmental markers that are not immediately obvious. Some stones appear to reference each other across distances, as if the entire site were part of a unified conceptual framework, rather than a collection of independent buildings. This level of coordination implies a social structure capable of organising large-scale labour and maintaining shared symbolic meaning across time. Yet the most unsettling detail remains the silence surrounding its origin. No written historical tradition preserves memory of a civilization capable of this work. No myth from later cultures clearly identifies its creators. The site exists outside the known narrative of human development in the region, creating a gap that grows more difficult to ignore with each new layer uncovered. What begins as an archaeological curiosity slowly transforms into a question about the completeness of human history itself. Before the implications become fully clear, one final detail emerges from the soil evidence that the site was deliberately buried. Layers of fill and sediment suggest intentional covering rather than natural abandonment. The stones were not simply left behind, they were concealed. The reason for such an act remains unknown, but it hints at a moment of transition, perhaps even erasure, when a civilization chose or was forced to remove itself from visibility. The ground holds its silence again, but now it feels less like emptiness and more like suppression. Something vast once stood here, and its disappearance may not have been accidental. The first inscriptions lifted from the buried stones do not behave like ordinary ancient writing. They resist categorization in a way that unsettles even experienced epigraphers. At a glance, the symbols suggest familiarity, vertical strokes, geometric forms, repeated motifs that resemble early pictographic systems from the Near East, but the structure refuses alignment with any known linguistic lineage. There are no clear cognates, no shared grammatical scaffolding, no transitional scripts linking them to later alphabets. It is as if the language was removed from the evolutionary chain of writing entirely, leaving behind only isolated fragments embedded in stone. As more tablets and carved surfaces are uncovered, a pattern begins to emerge. The symbols are not random. They follow strict ordering principles, repeated sequences, and what appears to be hierarchical organization. Certain glyphs consistently appear in administrative context, while others cluster around what may be ritual or ceremonial spaces. This suggests a structured bureaucracy, not a symbolic art tradition. Yet without translation, the meaning remains locked, and scholars are forced to reconstruct context through architecture rather than language. The first breakthrough comes not from a single inscription, but from comparison. Stones separated by hundreds of meters begin to reveal mirrored sequences, A symbol that appears at the entrance of one structure reappears deep within another, always in similar positional roles. This positional consistency suggests that the system is syntactic rather than purely pictorial. In other words, it behaves like language governed by rules, not decoration driven by aesthetics. That realization shifts the entire interpretive framework from speculation about meaning to the possibility of decoding a forgotten administrative world. Excavators also begin to notice something more unusual. Certain symbols appear only in high-status contexts, carved with deeper precision and more careful alignment. These markings are associated with large communal spaces and elevated platforms, suggesting governance or ritual authority. Other symbols, simpler and more repetitive, appear in storage areas or infrastructural zones. The distribution implies a stratified society with defined roles, record-keeping, and possibly taxation or resource allocation. What initially looked like an isolated ceremonial site now begins to resemble the administrative heart of a complex civilization. Yet even as structure becomes clearer, origin remains opaque. No neighbouring culture preserves a similar script. No transitional inscription has been found in surrounding regions that could explain its development. This absence creates discontinuity that challenges the basic assumptions of cultural diffusion. If writing systems typically evolve through contact and gradual modification, this system appears to have emerged fully formed, already functional, already complex, and already standardized. The linguistic isolation deepens the mystery. Some scholars cautiously propose that the system may represent a lost branch of early symbolic communication that diverged before known writing traditions crystallized. Others suggest a deliberate cultural separation, a society that intentionally maintained linguistic independence to preserve identity or control information. But neither explanation accounts for the scale of uniformity across the entire site, which implies centralized coordination over vast distances and long periods. As excavation expands, fragments of administrative objects appear alongside the inscriptions. Clay ceilings, broken storage jars, and carved markers suggest regulated movement of goods. The distribution of these artifacts implies organized trade or internal redistribution systems. This is not the material footprint of a small ritual enclave. It is the infrastructure of a state, one capable of managing production, storage, and allocation across multiple centers of activity. Still, the silence in the historical record grows more difficult to reconcile. If such a system existed, it should have left traces in surrounding civilizations. Trade records, borrowed symbols, shared technological innovations none appear in later cultures with clarity. The absence feels less like neglect and more like removal. Something interrupts the continuity between this civilization and the historical narratives that follow. One detail becomes particularly striking. In several deeply buried layers, inscriptions appear deliberately defaced before being covered. Symbols are scratched out, partially erased, or overwritten with uniform markings that do not match the original script. This suggests a controlled process of modification or suppression. Whether this represents political transition, conquest, or intentional erasure is unclear, but it introduces a troubling possibility. The disappearance of this civilization may not have been passive. The stones remain, heavy and unmoving, but the language they carry begins to feel less like a puzzle and more like a sealed record. Each symbol is a fragment of a system that once governed real people, real cities, and real decisions. And the deeper the decoding effort goes, the more it becomes apparent that this was not a marginal society on the edge of ancient history. It may have been central to it, hidden beneath later narratives that never preserved its name. The first partial readings of the inscriptions do not arrive as sudden revelation, but a slow alignment between patterns that were never meant to be separated. A repeated sequence of symbols begins to correspond, imperfectly at first, with known administrative formulas from later Bronze Age cultures. It is not translation in the direct sense, but recognition of structure lists of commodities, references to territories, indications of labour assignments. The language, once thought entirely alien, begins to reveal itself as bureaucratic rather than poetic, functional rather than ceremonial in its core usage. This realization changes the tone of the excavation. What was once treated as an isolated mystery site now starts to resemble the centre of a complex administrative network. The repetition of standardized phrases across distant structures suggests centralized record-keeping, possibly managed by scribes trained in a formal system of writing. The consistency implies not improvisation, but education, transmission, and institutional memory. A civilization capable of producing such uniformity would require schools, archives, and a governing class responsible for maintaining linguistic discipline across generations. As more inscriptions are compared, a faint connection emerges with later Anatolian linguistic fragments, particularly those associated with Indo-European speaking groups that appear in the region after the collapse of Bronze Age systems. Certain root structures, though heavily altered, show similarities in grammatical positioning and syntactic order. These parallels are fragile and debated, but they open a possibility that this buried civilization may have influenced later cultural formations in ways that were never fully recorded or remembered. The archaeological context reinforces this growing complexity. Storage facilities discovered alongside inscribed stones contain evidence of large-scale resource management, grain residues, animal remains, and standardized storage containers suggest centralized distribution systems. These are not the traces of scattered settlements. They indicate coordinated economic planning, where surplus production was collected, recorded, and redistributed according to administrative decisions encoded in writing. At the same time, the spatial organization of the site begins to reveal deliberate hierarchy. Large stone enclosures appear to occupy central positions, while smaller structures radiate outward in patterned clusters. The arrangement suggests a political geography embedded directly into architecture, where physical space reflects administrative rank or functional specialization. Such planning implies a governing authority capable of long-term urban design, not merely reactive construction. Yet the deeper the reconstruction goes, the more unstable the historical continuity becomes. There is still no clear developmental pathway leading to this civilization, no earlier experimental phases, no regional precursors that show gradual evolution towards such complexity. It appears as though a fully developed administrative state has materialized without visible origin. This discontinuity forces archaeologists to confront an uncomfortable possibility: that significant portions of early human political development may be missing from the record entirely. Competing interpretations begin to surface within scholarly circles. One school argues that the civilization must have existed in a region not yet fully excavated, its earlier stages buried beneath modern landscapes or lost to geological change. Another suggests that what is being uncovered represents not a single continuous civilization, but a federation of interconnected groups that rapidly standardize their systems during a brief but intense period of cultural convergence. Both explanations attempt to preserve continuity, but neither fully accounts for the suddenness and uniformity of the system's appearance. A more unsettling detail emerges from stratigraphic analysis. In several excavation layers, administrative objects appear suddenly, without transitional debris. There are no gradual increases in complexity in surrounding material culture. Instead, the system seems to be inserted into the archaeological record at full scale, as if an already functioning bureaucracy was placed into an existing landscape. This observation does not imply supernatural intervention, but it does challenge conventional expectations of cultural development over time. The inscriptions themselves begin to hint at territorial language. Certain recurring terms appear to reference boundaries, controlled zones, and designated production areas. If interpreted correctly, these suggest an organized territorial state rather than a loose network of settlements. The scale implied is vast, potentially encompassing multiple ecological zones and resource systems. Such a structure would require not only administrative sophistication, but also logistical coordination across distances that would have been difficult to manage without reliable communication routes. Even more intriguing is the subtle shift in later inscriptions. Some markings appear to reference disruptions in supply chains, irregularities in record-keeping, and unusual administrative corrections. These fragments suggest that the system was not static. It evolved, adapted, and at times struggled with internal pressures. The presence of corrections implies active management of crisis situations, though the nature of those crises remains unclear. By the end of this phase of analysis, the civilization begins to take shape not as a mystery of absence, but as a presence that was deliberately hidden in plain sight. The more it is reconstructed, the more it resembles a superpower of the ancient world, one that operated with a level of organization comparable to or exceeding its better-known contemporaries. And yet, paradoxically, it remains almost entirely absent from later historical memory, as if its existence was systematically removed from the narrative of human development. The reconstruction of this forgotten civilization shifts from fragments of language into something far more unsettling: the outline of a power that once operated at the center of its world. As inscriptions accumulate and administrative patterns become clearer, a picture emerges of a state that did not simply exist on the margins of early history, but one that actively shaped the political and economic landscape of the Bronze Age. Its influence, though erased from later records, appears embedded in the infrastructure of neighbouring regions in ways that were never fully recognised. The earliest signs of its rise do not resemble conquest in the conventional sense. There is little evidence of abrupt military expansion or dramatic cultural replacement. Instead, the civilization appears to have grown through accumulation and integration, gradually extending its administrative reach across interconnected settlements. Small communities begin to show standardized weights, shared symbolic systems, and synchronized production patterns. These subtle alignments suggest a slow but deliberate process of consolidation, where autonomy was replaced by coordination under a larger governing structure. At the heart of this system lies a level of organization that challenges earlier assumptions about early state formation. The inscriptions reveal references to tiered administrative roles, suggesting a bureaucracy with specialized functions. Some individuals are associated with resource allocation, others with labor coordination, and others still with record verification. This division of responsibility implies not only complexity but also stability, as such systems require training, institutional continuity, and trust in written authority. As the civilization expands, its presence becomes increasingly visible in material culture beyond its core territory. Standardized architectural forms appear in distant regions, suggesting either direct construction by its agents or strong cultural influence over local builders. Storage systems, road alignments, and even settlement layouts begin to echo the central administrative model. This diffusion suggests a power that does not rely solely on force, but on structural integration, embedding itself into the daily functioning of multiple societies. Yet despite this apparent reach, there is a striking absence of direct historical acknowledgement from neighbouring civilizations. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and early Aegean records make no clear reference to a power of this configuration and scale. Where such a state should appear in diplomatic correspondence, tribute lists, or war accounts. There is instead silence or ambiguity. This absence raises the possibility that references to this civilization were either lost, deliberately omitted, or recorded under names that have not yet been correctly identified. Some scholars propose that the civilization may have been known to others under different designations, fragmented across multiple regional labels that modern historians have not yet connected. Others suggest that later dominant powers may have actively suppressed references to it, either to legitimize their own rise or to simplify political narratives. While these ideas remain speculative, the consistency of archaeological evidence supporting the civilization's scale makes the absence in written history increasingly difficult to explain through coincidence alone. Further excavation reveals signs of long-distance coordination. Certain administrative seals and standardized markings appear in sites far removed from the central region, suggesting an extensive network of controlled or affiliated settlements. The uniformity of these markings indicates a shared administrative language that transcended local variation. Such consistency across geography implies either direct governance or an exceptionally strong cultural economic system that maintained cohesion over vast distances. At the same time, subtle fractures begin to appear in the later layers of occupation. In some regions, the standardized systems show signs of adaptation or deviation. Local variations emerge in administrative symbols, suggesting either decentralization or the beginning of regional autonomy. These shifts hint at internal complexity, possibly even tension between central authority and peripheral regions. The system, once highly uniform, begins to show signs of strain. Environmental data recovered from sediment layers introduces another dimension to this evolving picture. Evidence points to periods of climatic instability during the height of the civilization's expansion. Fluctuations in rainfall, agricultural yields, and resource availability may have placed increasing pressure on centralized distribution networks. A system built on large-scale coordination would be particularly vulnerable to disruptions in supply chains, especially if dependent on consistent environmental conditions. It is within this context that the civilization's scale becomes both its strength and its vulnerability. The same administrative sophistication that allowed it to integrate vast regions may also have made it rigid, dependent on stability that the natural world no longer provided. Even small disruptions in one region could propagate through the system, amplifying instability across distant territories. Despite these emerging clues, no single explanation fully accounts for the civilization's sudden rise or its later disappearance from historical memory. The archaeological record suggests power, complexity, and reach, but the documentary silence of neighbouring cultures remains unresolved. The result is a paradox, a civilization large enough to shape its world, yet absent from the narratives of that world. As the excavation continues, attention shifts from its origins to its fragility. The signs of strain embedded in later layers suggest that the collapse, when it comes, may not be sudden destruction from outside forces, but something more internal and systemic. A superpower built on coordination may also have contained the seeds of its own fragmentation, waiting for conditions to shift just enough to unravel its carefully maintained order. The expansion of this forgotten superpower does not resemble the sharp-edged conquest of later empires. There are no dramatic burn layers marking sweeping invasions, no clear horizons of sudden destruction that would signal a violent march across continents. Instead, what emerges from the soil is something more subtle and, in some ways, more unsettling. The civilization expands like a tightening net, extending its influence through administration, infrastructure, and standardized systems that slowly absorb surrounding regions into a shared framework of control. Across central Anatolia and beyond, settlements begin to show synchronized patterns of construction that align with the central model uncovered at the original site. Storage facilities follow consistent proportions. Public spaces adopt similar spatial hierarchies. Even the orientation of buildings begins to reflect shared planning principles, as though distant communities are operating under a common set of architectural rules. This uniformity suggests not random imitation, but coordinated governance, or at least a deeply influential cultural authority that shapes how communities organize themselves. The inscriptions reinforce this impression. Repeated references to designated zones, resource corridors, and production regions suggest a territorial system divided not merely by geography, but by function. Certain areas appear to specialize in agricultural output, others in mineral extraction, and others in craft production. This level of economic segmentation implies a sophisticated understanding of resource management, one that requires both accurate record-keeping and reliable transportation networks to function effectively. Road fragments and pathway alignments begin to support this interpretation. In multiple excavation zones, traces of ancient routes appear, sometimes faint but consistently oriented towards central hubs. These routes are not casual footpaths. Their straightened segments and repeated use patterns suggest maintained infrastructure, possibly designed to facilitate movement of goods, officials, and information. When mapped together, they hint at a system of connectivity that extends far beyond isolated settlements. Yet the most striking evidence of expansion lies not in physical roads or buildings, but in the consistency of administrative symbols across vast distances. The same sequences of markings found in the central archive reappear hundreds of kilometers away, sometimes with only minor regional variation. This suggests a shared bureaucratic language, one capable of transmitting orders, records, and directives across an extensive territory. Such uniformity implies either direct administrative oversight or a highly disciplined network of local authorities operating under centralized standards. Despite this apparent cohesion, there are hints that the system is not entirely uniform in practice. Peripheral regions show slight deviations in symbol usage, variations in storage practices, and localized adaptations of central models. These differences suggest that while the civilization maintained strong structural influence, it also allowed or tolerated regional flexibility. This balance between control and adaptation may have been one of the key factors behind its rapid expansion. At its height, the civilization appears to have functioned as an interconnected economic organism. Agricultural surplus from fertile zones flows into central redistribution hubs. Manufactured goods move outward along established corridors. Administrative records track these flows with remarkable precision, indicating a society deeply invested in quantifying and regulating its own material existence. This level of abstraction in governance suggests not only technological capability, but also a cultural emphasis on order and predictability. However, expansion on this scale inevitably introduces strain. As more regions are incorporated, the complexity of coordination increases exponentially. The inscriptions begin to reflect this tension in subtle ways. References to delays in transport, inconsistencies in supply records, and administrative corrections appear more frequently in later layers. These are not signs of collapse yet, but they indicate a system under increasing pressure, adjusting continuously to maintain equilibrium across a widening network. Environmental conditions may have contributed to this growing fragility. Evidence from sediment cores suggests fluctuating climate patterns during the period of maximum expansion. Periodic droughts and irregular rainfall cycles would have disrupted agricultural outputs, placing stress on redistribution systems that depended on predictability. In a tightly integrated economy, even localized shortages could ripple outward, affecting distant regions that relied on consistent supply flows. There is also the question of communication speed. While the administrative system appears highly organized, the physical limitations of Bronze Age transport would have imposed delays between central decisions and regional implementation. As the empire expanded, these delays may have become increasingly significant, creating gaps between policy and reality that were difficult to reconcile. Over time, such gaps could lead to regional autonomy by necessity rather than design. Despite these challenges, the civilization persists, adapting its systems rather than abandoning them. The inscriptions suggest ongoing reforms, adjustments in resource allocation, and recalibrations of administrative boundaries. This flexibility indicates resilience, but also hints at underlying instability that requires constant management. The system is not static, it is actively maintained in a state of controlled balance. Yet even at its peak, there is an absence that continues to haunt the archaeological narrative. No neighbouring civilization clearly records its presence in a way that matches its apparent scale. This contradiction deepens the mystery of its historical erasure. Either the records have been lost, fragmented beyond recognition, or later, civilizations chose not to preserve its memory in full. As the evidence accumulates, a picture forms of a superpower that expanded not through singular conquest, but through systemic integration of its world, a civilization that reshaped regions not by erasing them, but by reorganizing them into a unified structure, and in doing so, it may have become so embedded in the fabric of its time that its eventual disappearance left behind no clear boundary between presence and absence, only the slow fading of a system once held together by the precision of its own design. Among the most revealing discoveries of this forgotten civilization are fragments of diplomatic correspondence preserved in clay and stone, material that once carried messages between powers who considered themselves equals in a fragile and shifting world. These records do not announce dominance in the way later empires often do. Instead, they reveal negotiation, careful phrasing, and an awareness of mutual dependency between great states that shared the Bronze Age landscape. Some of the clearest parallels emerge when these inscriptions are compared with diplomatic practices known from Egypt and Mesopotamia. The structure of the messages suggests formalized exchange between rulers who recognized each other's authority. There are references to agreements concerning borders, trade corridors, and the exchange of luxury goods. The language is restrained, almost ceremonial, yet beneath it lies a recognition of political balance. This civilization, once thought absent from historical memory, appears to have been part of a network of major powers that shaped the ancient world through diplomacy as much as through force. The most striking implication of these records is the suggestion of parity. The tone of the inscriptions does not place this civilization in a subordinate position. Instead, it appears to engage on equal footing with the major centers of power known from later historical tradition. References to coordinated agreements, shared resource management, and mutual obligations suggest a system of international relations far more complex than previously assumed for this period. Yet despite these indications, there is a noticeable absence in surviving Egyptian and Mesopotamian records. Where one might expect references to such a significant counterpart, the historical archives remain silent or ambiguous. Some scholars propose that the civilization may be hidden under alternate names or fragmented references that have not yet been correctly identified. Others suggest that later political revisions may have selectively emphasized certain alliances while minimizing others. The silence is not proof of absence, but it is a gap that grows more difficult to ignore as evidence accumulates from the buried archives. One particularly intriguing set of inscriptions appears to describe formalized treaties involving boundary agreements and resource sharing. The structure of these documents follows a recognizable diplomatic format, declarations of mutual recognition, clauses concerning obligations, and references to divine witnesses who are invoked to guarantee compliance. These elements suggest a shared diplomatic culture across multiple Bronze Age states, one that relied on standardized protocols to maintain stability in a competitive geopolitical environment. The existence of such treaties implies a world far more interconnected than once believed. Trade goods recovered from excavation layers, metals, ceramics, and rare materials indicate long-distance exchange networks that span vast regions. Certain materials originate from areas far beyond the core territory of the civilization, suggesting active participation in international trade systems. These networks would have required not only economic coordination, but also political agreements to ensure safe passage and mutual benefit. At the same time, the inscriptions hint at underlying tensions. Some documents reference disputes over resources, contested territories, and negotiated settlements that appear to resolve ongoing conflicts. The language remains formal, but the repetition of such disputes suggests a geopolitical environment marked by persistent competition. Even among great powers, stability is not permanent, but continuously negotiated. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of a dynamic and interconnected world. Fortified settlements appear in strategic locations, often positioned near trade routes or resource-rich zones. These sites show signs of both defensive preparation and administrative control, suggesting that security and governance were deeply intertwined. The civilization's expansion into these networks may have been as much about securing trade as it was about territorial control. Yet the most puzzling aspect remains the inconsistency between this evidence and later historical memory. If such a civilization participated in formal diplomacy with Egypt and Mesopotamia, its absence from their surviving records becomes increasingly difficult to explain. Some inscriptions hint at possible indirect references, but they are fragmentary and open to interpretation. The possibility arises that later historical transmission may have selectively preserved certain narratives while allowing others to fade into obscurity. Another layer of complexity emerges when considering the symbolic language used in these diplomatic texts. Certain motifs appear consistently across different regions, suggesting shared ideological frameworks or common religious references invoked in international agreements. These shared symbols may have functioned as a form of diplomatic shorthand, reinforcing trust and continuity between distant political entities. However, even within this system of apparent stability, there are signs of shifting power dynamics. Some treaties appear to be renegotiated over time, with adjustments reflecting changing economic or political conditions. This fluidity suggests that the balance of power was not fixed but constantly evolving. The civilization's role within the system may have changed across generations, moving between influence, adaptation, and eventual decline. What becomes increasingly clear is that this civilization was not isolated or peripheral. It was integrated into a broader world of exchange, diplomacy, and competition. Its disappearance from historical memory is therefore not simply the loss of an isolated culture, but the erasure of a participant in a wider international system whose full structure is only now beginning to re-emerge from fragmented evidence. As more inscriptions are analysed, the impression grows stronger that the ancient world was not a collection of disconnected civilizations, but a tightly interwoven network of states whose interactions shaped the trajectory of early history. And within that network, this forgotten superpower appears not as an anomaly, but as a central actor whose absence from later narratives represents one of the most profound gaps in the understanding of human political development. Deep within the administrative layers of this forgotten civilization, the picture of its internal machinery becomes increasingly precise. What initially appeared as scattered inscriptions and architectural remnants now resolves into the structure of a highly organized state, one that depends not only on authority but on systems designed to sustain authority over time. The evidence points toward a society that treated governance itself as a form of engineering, carefully constructed, maintained, and adjusted to preserve equilibrium across vast regions. At the center of this system is a bureaucracy that extends far beyond simple record-keeping. The inscriptions reveal multiple tiers of administrative function, each responsible for different aspects of governance. Some officials oversee agricultural output, others manage redistribution networks, while still others are tasked with verifying records and maintaining standardized measurements. This division of labor suggests a state that has moved beyond tribal or kinship-based organization into a fully institutionalized form of governance, where authority is distributed across specialized roles rather than concentrated in a single point of control. The consistency of administrative terminology across distant sites reinforces this impression. Certain titles and designations appear repeatedly, even across regions separated by significant geographical barriers. This implies a shared training system for officials, possibly involving centralized education or apprenticeship structures. The existence of such a system would require not only literacy, but also standardized instruction in administrative procedures, suggesting a level of societal complexity that rivals later classical civilizations. Religious structures uncovered alongside administrative centers provide another layer of insight. These are not isolated temples, but integrated components of civic architecture. Ritual spaces are often positioned adjacent to storage facilities or governing halls, indicating that religious authority and administrative power are closely intertwined. The inscription suggests that divine sanction plays a role in legitimizing bureaucratic decisions, reinforcing the authority of the state through shared belief systems that bind communities together. In some cases, administrative records reference offerings, ceremonial duties, and calendrical events tied directly to governance cycles. This suggests that religious observance is not separate from political administration, but embedded within it. Seasonal rituals may align with agricultural planning, redistribution schedules, or tax collection cycles, creating a system in which spiritual and economic life operate in synchronized rhythm. Urban layouts further reflect this integration of governance and belief. Excavated settlements reveal structured zoning, with administrative to residential and ritual spaces carefully arranged according to a consistent pattern. Central districts often contain large complexes that combine storage, governance, and ceremonial functions, suggesting that leadership operated within multifunctional spaces rather than isolated palatial structures. This spatial organisation implies a society that prioritises efficiency and cohesion over individual display of power. Infrastructure systems uncovered in the archaeological record reveal additional layers of sophistication. Water management structures, storage silos, and transportation routes demonstrate coordinated planning across large territories. These systems are not isolated innovations but parts of a broader network designed to support population stability and economic resilience. The scale of coordination required suggests centralised planning mechanisms capable of forecasting needs and distributing resources accordingly. Yet even as the administrative system appears highly refined, subtle indicators of strain begin to surface. Certain records show inconsistencies in resource reporting, adjustments in quotas, and repeated revisions of distribution plans. These fluctuations suggest that the system is not operating under stable conditions, but is constantly adapting to changing realities on the ground, whether due to environmental variability, population pressure, or logistical limitations. The bureaucracy appears increasingly burdened by the complexity of its own design. One particularly revealing detail comes from storage records that show cycles of surplus followed by unexpected shortages. These fluctuations imply that production and distribution are not perfectly synchronized, despite the sophistication of the administrative network. In a system so tightly integrated, even small disruptions can cascade through multiple levels of governance, creating instability that must be continuously managed. The integration of religion and administration may also contribute to this rigidity. Systems that rely on ritualized governance can become resistant to rapid adaptation, as changes may require not only bureaucratic approval, but also ideological justification. This dual requirement can slow decision-making processes at critical moments, especially in times of environmental or economic stress. Despite these challenges, the civilization maintains its coherence for an extended period. The inscriptions suggest ongoing adjustments, reforms, and recalibrations designed to preserve stability. Officials are recorded modifying resource allocations, reorganizing administrative boundaries, and updating procedural guidelines. This indicates a system capable of learning and adapting, even if only within the constraints of its own structure. However, the very precision that enables its strength may also contain the seeds of vulnerability. A civilization so dependent on standardized systems becomes sensitive to disruptions that affect standardization itself. Variability in climate, population movement, or external pressure could destabilize the delicate balance upon which the entire administrative framework rests. As the excavation continues, the civilization's internal machinery becomes clearer, but so does its fragility. It is not a simple structure of power imposed from above, but a complex network of interdependent systems, each relying on the others to function, and within this complexity lies a quiet tension, one that suggests that maintaining order in such a vast and interconnected society may require more constant effort than any single governing centre could sustainably provide. At the edges of this reconstructed world, where the influence of the buried civilization meets the fragmented records of its neighbours, a more unstable picture begins to form. The Bronze Age landscape is not a simple stage of isolated kingdoms, but a dense and shifting field of competing powers, alliances, and emerging states, each trying to secure resources, trade routes, and political survival. Within this landscape, the forgotten superpower does not exist alone. It exists in tension, surrounded by rivals that both depend on it and resist its reach. To the west, emerging Aegean societies begin to show faint traces of contact. While the material evidence is indirect, certain technological similarities suggest exchange of knowledge or goods. Pottery styles evolve in ways that echo Eastern administrative aesthetics, though adapted into local traditions. These parallels are not strong enough to indicate direct control, but they point to interaction, likely through trade networks that span across coastal corridors. Such connections would have facilitated the movement of metals, textiles, and ideas across regions that are often treated as separate historical spheres. To the south, Egypt stands as a more clearly documented power, its inscriptions offering a relatively continuous historical record. Yet even here, the presence of this buried civilization is elusive. Egyptian records describe interactions with powerful northern states, sometimes referred to in broad or ambiguous terms, but the specifics remain frustratingly unclear. The absence of a direct and recognizable name raises questions about how identities were recorded, translated, or possibly reinterpreted through different linguistic systems over time. In the east, Mesopotamian kingdoms document a world of shifting alliances and rival city-states. Trade records and diplomatic texts reveal a highly interconnected system of exchange, where political stability is constantly negotiated through agreements and conflict. Within this framework, references to distant powers occasionally appear, but they are fragmented, possibly encoded under different names or filtered through layers of translation and cultural reinterpretation. The buried civilization may have existed within this network without ever being clearly isolated as a single identifiable entity in surviving records. What emerges from this broader context is a world defined not by isolation, but by interdependence. Resources, technologies, and administrative practices move across regions in complex patterns. No single civilization operates in complete independence. Instead, power is distributed across a web of relationships that constantly shift in response to economic and environmental pressures. Within this web, the forgotten superpower appears to have been one of the central nodes, deeply embedded in the functioning of the system as a whole. Yet this interconnectedness also introduces instability. The same networks that facilitate exchange also transmit disruption. A breakdown in one region can ripple outward, affecting distant partners who rely on consistent flows of goods and information. Archaeological evidence suggests that such disruptions do occur periodically. Sudden changes in settlement patterns, abandonment of trade routes, and shifts in material culture indicate moments of systemic stress that affect multiple regions simultaneously. One of the most debated factors in this period is the movement of displaced populations across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological layers show signs of increased mobility, with communities relocating under uncertain conditions. These movements are often associated with environmental stress, resource scarcity, or political collapse in certain regions. While the exact causes remain uncertain, their impact on existing systems is clear. Established trade and administrative networks are forced to adapt rapidly or risk fragmentation. Within this volatile environment, the buried civilization appears both resilient and increasingly pressured. Its administrative system, designed for stability and predictability, must now operate under conditions of uncertainty. Inscriptions from later phases show increased references to irregular supply flows, emergency redistribution measures, and regional adjustments to standard procedures. These are not signs of immediate collapse, but of a system operating under sustained strain. Rival states, whether emerging or established, also contribute to this pressure. Competition for trade dominance and resource access intensifies over time. Fortified sites increase in number across key corridors, suggesting heightened concern over territorial security. Even if direct conflict is not always evident in the archaeological record, the expansion of defensive structures indicates a world increasingly aware of instability and the need to protect critical infrastructure. At the same time, alliances form and dissolve with remarkable fluidity. Diplomatic agreements are renewed, revised, or replaced depending on shifting political and environmental conditions. This dynamic environment requires constant negotiation, reinforcing the importance of administrative systems capable of adapting quickly. Yet the buried civilization, with its emphasis on standardization and centralized coordination, may have found such flexibility increasingly difficult to maintain. A subtle but important shift appears in the distribution of administrative symbols during this period. Regional variations become more pronounced, suggesting that local authorities are gradually exercising greater autonomy. While central systems remain present, their influence appears less absolute than in earlier phases. This decentralization may reflect adaptation to local conditions, but it also signals a loosening of structural cohesion. Scholars examining these patterns note that such fragmentation often precedes larger systemic transformations. When interconnected networks lose their ability to maintain uniform standards, they begin to evolve into more localized systems of governance. Over time, this process can lead to the dissolution of centralized authority without a single defining moment of collapse. Yet even as this process unfolds, the civilization does not disappear abruptly. Instead, it appears to fade into its own network, dissolving gradually into the very systems it once helped organize. Its influence persists in modified forms across neighboring regions, embedded within administrative practices, trade patterns, and cultural memory, even as its distinct identity becomes increasingly difficult to isolate. What remains is a world in transition, where no single power maintains absolute dominance, and where the boundaries between civilizations blur into overlapping zones of influence. Within this shifting landscape, the forgotten superpower is no longer clearly visible as a singular entity, but its structural imprint continues to shape the behavior of the world it once helped define. The environmental record begins to speak in a language older and colder than any inscription carved by human hands. Deep within sediment cores, pollen shifts, dust layers thicken, and chemical signatures change in ways that suggest long-term stress across multiple regions at once. The world in which this forgotten superpower once expanded is no longer stable in the background. It is becoming unstable in its own right. And the civilization's carefully calibrated systems begin to feel that instability first. Agriculture, the foundation of its administrative strength, shows early signs of disruption. Isotopic evidence from plant remains suggests irregular growing conditions, with cycles of drought interrupting what were once predictable harvest patterns. In a system that depends on standardized output and centralized redistribution, even modest fluctuations in production can produce cascading effects. Storage facilities that were once balanced begin to show uneven accumulation, with some regions reporting surplus while others experience shortages. The inscriptions reflect this shift with quiet but persistent concern. Administrative records increasingly reference recalculations, revised quotas, and emergency reallocations of grain and livestock. These are not isolated anomalies but recurring adjustments, suggesting that environmental variability is no longer episodic but sustained. The bureaucracy responds as it was designed to do by recording, correcting, and redistributing. But the frequency of correction begins to increase, and with it, the pressure on the system itself. At the same time, long-distance trade networks begin to show signs of fragmentation. Materials that once flowed consistently across regions appear in reduced quantities or with irregular timing. Certain metals and luxury goods become less common in central administrative contexts, suggesting disruptions in extraction or transport routes. Archaeological layers in peripheral settlements show abandoned storage sites and restructured trade hubs, as if communities are reorganizing themselves in response to unstable supply chains. One of the most significant pressures appears to come from climate variability across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Multiple independent studies of ancient environmental proxies point toward periods of drought, interspersed with sudden climatic shifts. These changes do not necessarily affect all regions equally, but in an interconnected system, uneven impact becomes destabilizing in itself. Regions that rely on each other for balanced exchange begin to experience mismatches between production and demand. As conditions worsen, human mobility increases. Archaeological evidence shows population movements into previously established territories, often in areas with stronger water access or more reliable agricultural output. These migrations place additional strain on existing administrative structures, which must now accommodate not only economic redistribution, but also demographic instability. Settlements expand in some areas while contracting in others, creating a patchwork of pressure points across the landscape. The inscriptions begin to reflect a shift in tone, where earlier records emphasize order, classification, and routine management. Later texts include more frequent references to disruption, uncertainty, and corrective measures. Administrative language becomes more reactive. Systems designed for long-term planning are increasingly forced into short-term crisis management. The consistency that once defined the bureaucracy begins to erode under the weight of environmental unpredictability. External pressure compounds these internal challenges. Groups often described in later historical traditions as migratory or displaced populations begin to appear more frequently in the archaeological record. Their movement is not easily categorized as invasion or expansion. Instead, it appears as a series of complex interactions involving trade, conflict, and settlement. In some regions, these groups integrate into existing systems. In others, they contribute to the breakdown of established administrative control. Fortified sites become more common across strategic corridors. Walls are reinforced, and defensive positions are expanded. This suggests a growing awareness of instability, both environmental and political. However, fortification alone does not address the underlying systemic stress. A network designed for coordination and redistribution is not easily adapted to conditions of fragmentation and rapid change. Within the central administrative framework, evidence suggests increasing strain on record-keeping systems. Variations in accounting practices appear between regions that were once standardized. Some inscriptions show corrections layered over earlier entries, while others omit expected categories of information. These inconsistencies may reflect local adaptation, but they also suggest a gradual breakdown in uniform administrative control. Despite these pressures, the civilization does not collapse immediately. Instead, it continues to operate, adapting its systems in real time. Redistribution networks are adjusted, storage priorities are revised, and administrative boundaries are reconfigured. This adaptability delays systemic failure, but it also indicates that the system is now operating outside its original design parameters. Stability is no longer assumed, it must be actively maintained. Environmental stress, migration, and external pressure combine to create a complex feedback loop. Each factor reinforces the others. Reduced agricultural output leads to resource competition. Competition encourages migration. Migration disrupts administrative coordination. The system becomes increasingly reactive, responding to crises as they emerge rather than preventing them in advance. Yet even in this period of instability, there is no single catastrophic moment that can be identified as the definitive collapse. Instead, the evidence suggests a prolonged phase of degradation, where different regions experience failure at different times and in different ways. Some areas maintain partial continuity, while others fragment entirely. The civilization begins to dissolve not as a single event, but as a process distributed across time and geography. In this gradual unravelling, the most striking feature is not destruction, but adaptation under strain. The administrative system continues to function, but with diminishing coherence. What once operated as a unified structure becomes a collection of increasingly independent components, each attempting to preserve stability within its own limited domain. By the end of this phase, the civilization that once appeared as a tightly integrated superpower is no longer visible as a single entity. It exists instead as overlapping remnants of its former structure, still operating, still recording, but no longer synchronized. The world it once organized is beginning to move beyond its control, and the system that defined its strength is slowly becoming the mechanism of its fragmentation. There is no single line in the soil that marks the moment this civilization ends. No unmistakable horizon of ash, no universal layer of destruction, no sudden silence that would indicate a clean break from one era to another. Instead, the archaeological record presents something far more unsettling, a slow disassembly of order, unfolding unevenly across regions that once shared a unified administrative logic. Cities do not fall at the same time. Systems do not fail in a single sequence. Everything begins to loosen, then drift, then fragment. In some centres, administrative activity continues long after surrounding regions have already begun to reorganize themselves into smaller, independent units. Seal impressions are still used, records are still kept, and storage facilities still function, But the scale has changed, the flow of goods becomes localized, long-distance coordination weakens. What remains is not collapse in the dramatic sense, but contraction, as if each region is folding inward to preserve its own stability. Elsewhere, the evidence is more abrupt. Certain administrative hubs show signs of rapid abandonment. Storage facilities are left partially filled, records incomplete, tools and ceilings left behind without clear indication of evacuation or destruction. These sites suggest moments of sudden disruption, but without the widespread destruction patterns associated with conquest or natural disaster. The absence of burning layers or systematic levelling implies that the cause is not uniform warfare, but something more fragmented and uneven in its effects. One of the most striking patterns during this phase is the breakdown of synchronization between regions. Earlier layers show consistent standards in measurement, language, and administrative practice across vast distances. Later layers show divergence. Weights begin to vary. Symbol usage becomes inconsistent. Even architectural conventions drift away from standardized forms. This divergence suggests that the central authority, whatever its nature, is no longer able to enforce uniformity across its network. The inscriptions reflect this transformation with increasing clarity. References to central directives become less frequent, replaced by localized decision-making. Terms associated with coordination give way to terminology focused on self-management, adaptation, and contingency planning. The language of unity is replaced by the language of survival. What once functioned as a single administrative organism is now behaving like a collection of loosely connected systems, each responding independently to shared pressures. In some regions, there is evidence of deliberate restructuring. Administrative boundaries are redrawn, storage systems reorganized, and resource allocation adjusted to reflect reduced connectivity. These changes suggest not only breakdown, but conscious adaptation to new conditions. Local authorities appear to be responding pragmatically to the loss of central coordination, attempting to preserve functionality even as the larger system weakens. Other areas show less stability. Abrupt discontinuities in the archaeological record suggest that some centres cease operation without clear transition. Yet even here, the absence of destruction layers remains notable. The evidence does not point to a single catastrophic invasion or environmental event capable of simultaneously affecting all regions. Instead, it points toward a cascading process, where localized failures accumulate until the broader system can no longer sustain coherence. The movement of populations during this period becomes increasingly complex. Rather than a single wave of migration, the record indicates multiple overlapping movements. Some groups relocate into abandoned areas, repurposing existing infrastructure. Others move into previously peripheral zones, establishing new settlements with simplified administrative systems. This redistribution of population contributes further to the fragmentation of the original structure. As old networks are replaced by more localized patterns of organization, trade networks, once the lifeblood of the civilization's integration, continue to deteriorate. Long-distance exchange becomes sporadic, then regional, then largely local. Materials that once moved across vast territories now circulate within smaller economic spheres. The loss of standardization accelerates this process, as variations in measurement and classification make large-scale coordination increasingly difficult. Yet even as the system fragments, remnants of the original administrative culture persist. Certain symbols continue to appear in modified forms, suggesting cultural memory rather than institutional continuity. These survivals indicate that the civilization does not vanish entirely, but transforms as it dissolves, leaving traces embedded within successor systems that inherit fragments of its structure without fully preserving its original coherence. Scholars examining this phase often emphasize the absence of a singular explanatory mechanism. No evidence points to a catastrophic external force capable of erasing such a widespread and complex system in a single event. Instead, the collapse appears to result from the interaction of multiple stress factors: environmental variability, economic strain, administrative overload, and increasing regional autonomy. Each factor alone may have been manageable, but together they produce a cumulative effect that gradually exceeds the system's capacity for integration. By the end of this process, what remains is not a fallen empire in the conventional sense, but a dispersed legacy. Former administrative centres persist as local settlements. Infrastructure is repurposed or abandoned. Written systems evolve into regional variants. The coherence that once defined the civilization is gone, replaced by a patchwork of smaller systems that retain faint echoes of their shared origin. The most difficult aspect of this transformation is its lack of closure. There is no definitive endpoint, no moment when the civilization can be said to have fully ceased. Instead, it fades unevenly across geography and time, leaving behind a world that no longer recognizes itself as part of a larger unified structure. And in that fragmentation lies the beginning of its disappearance from history itself. Long after the administrative networks have dissolved and the last coordinated systems have fractured into local fragments, something more subtle begins to happen. The civilization does not merely disappear from the landscape, it disappears from memory. What remains in the soil is gradually disconnected from what remains in later historical tradition, until the two no longer align in any meaningful way. The world forgets not through a single act of erasure, but through the slow erosion of continuity. Successor societies emerge across the same regions, but they inherit only partial understanding of what came before. They build upon reused foundations, repurpose older infrastructure, and occasionally incorporate surviving symbols into new cultural contexts. Yet the original meaning of those systems is no longer intact. administrative practices are simplified, writing systems are altered. Institutional memory is compressed into more localized traditions that no longer require knowledge of the broader structure that once unified the region. In some cases, later authorities appear to actively reshape historical narratives. References to earlier systems become vague, generalized, or symbolic rather than specific. Instead of detailed accounts of former governance, what survives are mythologized fragments, references to great ages, distant rulers, or ancestral powers whose identities are no longer clearly defined. Over time, these fragments detach from their original reference and become part of cultural storytelling rather than historical record. The archaeological record shows no single moment of deliberate destruction that would explain this loss of memory. Instead, it suggests progressive disconnection. As administrative continuity breaks down, so too does the transmission of accurate historical knowledge. Scribes trained in the old systems are replaced by new generations who inherit partial or modified versions of the past. Each transmission introduces small distortions until the original structure becomes unrecognizable. This process is reinforced by political transformation. As new regional powers consolidate, they often prioritize their own legitimacy narratives. In doing so, they emphasize origins that support their authority, while minimizing or reinterpreting earlier systems that do not fit their framework. The result is not necessarily intentional suppression, but selective preservation, where only certain aspects of the past are maintained, and others gradually fade from institutional record. Trade disruptions also contribute to this fragmentation of memory. As long-distance networks weaken, so does the exchange of standardized knowledge. Without consistent communication across regions, shared historical understanding begins to diverge. What one area remembers as a major administrative center, another may remember only as a minor settlement or ritual site. Over generations, these differences compound, creating a fractured historical landscape where no single narrative remains dominant. The inscriptions themselves begin to reflect this shift. Later texts show simplified versions of earlier symbols, often used in reduced or altered contexts. In some cases, original administrative terminology is repurposed for local governance or ceremonial use, stripped of its broader systemic meaning. What was once part of a vast bureaucratic structure becomes localized symbolism, detached from the scale and complexity of its origin. In the absence of continuous records, oral tradition takes on greater importance. Stories of earlier ages persist, but they evolve rapidly as they are retold across generations. Figures that may have originally represented administrative roles or institutional functions are reinterpreted as legendary rulers or cultural ancestors. Events that were once systemic processes become individualized narratives, easier to remember but less accurate in preserving historical structure. Meanwhile, the physical remnants of the civilization continue to exist in the landscape. Ruins remain visible, but their meaning becomes ambiguous. Without the linguistic framework to interpret inscriptions or administrative markers, later societies encounter these remains as isolated artifacts rather than components of a unified system. The scale of the original civilization becomes difficult to perceive, as its distributed structure is no longer recognizable as a single coherent entity. Some regions preserve more of the original system than others, but even these pockets of continuity eventually fragment. Over time, the differences between regions increase, and shared understanding diminishes. What was once a unified administrative language becomes a set of unrelated local variants. The historical thread that connected them weakens until it can no longer be traced with certainty. By the time later classical civilizations begin recording the history of the broader region, the earlier superpower is already absent from coherent narrative form. It appears only in indirect references, ambiguous names, or symbolic allusions that do not fully capture its original scale. The gap between archaeological evidence and historical memory becomes increasingly difficult to bridge. This absence is not absolute destruction, but selective visibility. The civilization is not entirely gone. It is scattered across fragments of memory, architecture, and linguistic residue. Yet without recognition of its systemic unity, these fragments cannot be assembled into a complete picture. The result is a historical silence that masks the existence of something once vast, structured, and deeply influential. What remains is a paradox, a civilization that once functioned as a central organizing force in its world, yet survives only as disjointed echoes in the records of others. Its disappearance is not marked by a single event, but by the gradual failure of memory itself to preserve the scale of what once existed. Centuries pass, and the world that once contained this forgotten superpower settles into new patterns of history writing, where memory is shaped less by what existed and more by what survives in usable form. In the surviving texts of later classical civilizations, the ancient past of the region is no longer a dense network of interacting states, but a simplified landscape of recognizable names, mythic fragments, and selectively preserved events. The missing civilization does not appear as a gap that demands explanation. It simply does not appear at all in any coherent form. Greek and later Roman traditions, which become some of the most influential frameworks for interpreting the ancient world, preserve only faint and distorted echoes of earlier Bronze Age realities. When they reference distant Eastern powers or legendary kingdoms, the descriptions are often filtered through layers of oral transmission, translation, and cultural reinterpretation. What may have once referred to structured administrative states is reframed as mythic polities, heroic realms, or semi-legendary territories situated at the edge of the known world. Within this process of reinterpretation, complexity is gradually reduced, The intricate administrative systems that once governed vast regions are no longer visible. Instead, later historians and storytellers focus on more narratively accessible elements: kings, wars, migrations, and divine interventions, large-scale bureaucratic structures, trade networks. And standardized governance systems rarely survive in these accounts unless they can be tied to a single recognizable figure or dramatic event. The absence of the buried civilization in these narratives is particularly striking because it contradicts what archaeology increasingly reveals. Material evidence shows that the region was once deeply interconnected, with extensive infrastructure and sophisticated administrative organization. Yet these features do not translate into the historical traditions that later dominate cultural memory. The disconnect suggests not ignorance alone, but a transformation in what kinds of history are preserved and transmitted. Part of this transformation is linguistic. As languages evolve, older administrative terminology loses its meaning. Words that once described specific bureaucratic functions or institutional roles become ambiguous or shift into more general usage. Without continuous access to the original linguistic framework, later cultures reinterpret unfamiliar terms through their own conceptual systems, often losing the structural meaning embedded in the original texts. Another factor is the nature of historical preservation itself. Ancient record-keeping systems are vulnerable to physical decay, political upheaval, and selective copying. When scribal traditions change, entire bodies of knowledge can be lost if they are not actively maintained. In this case, the fragmentation of the civilization's administrative system likely disrupted the transmission of its own historical records long before later civilizations encountered them. Even when fragments survive, they are often difficult to contextualize. Isolated inscriptions or artifacts may be preserved, but without the broader administrative framework that once gave them meaning, they appear as disconnected curiosities. Later interpreters may incorporate them into local traditions, assign them symbolic significance, or simply leave them unexplained. Over time, their original function becomes irretrievable. There are occasional hints, however, that some memory of the civilization persisted in distorted form. Certain classical references to ancient peoples or vanished kingdoms describe societies of extraordinary scale or antiquity. But these accounts are often inconsistent, geographically vague or mythologized. They may preserve echoes of real historical entities, but without sufficient detail to reconstruct their identity. Scholars debate whether these references point to fragmented memories of the buried superpower or to entirely separate traditions. The problem is compounded by the tendency of later historical writers to organize the past into simplified genealogies of power. Civilizations are often presented as linear successions rather than overlapping systems. This narrative structure makes it difficult to accommodate a complex and multi-regional administrative network that does not fit neatly into dynastic sequences. As a result, such systems are either compressed into single entities or omitted altogether. Meanwhile, the archaeological record remains silent beneath layers of soil, waiting for rediscovery. The physical evidence of the civilization's existence does not disappear, but it becomes disconnected from interpretive frameworks capable of explaining it. Without linguistic continuity or historical recognition, material remains cannot speak in a way that later cultures can fully understand. What emerges from this long process is a fundamental asymmetry between memory and material reality. The world that later civilizations describe is not necessarily false, but incomplete. It reflects what survived in transmission, not necessarily what once existed in full complexity. Within this gap lies the absence of the forgotten superpower, not erased by force, but obscured by the limitations of historical continuity. By the end of this classical filtering of history, the civilization has effectively vanished from narrative existence. It persists only as faint shadows in inherited traditions, waiting for a future moment when material evidence will force a reconsideration of what was once thought to be the complete story of the ancient world. The silence begins to break not through dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of anomalies in the modern archaeological record. For centuries, the ancient world of Anatolia and its surrounding regions had been interpreted through a relatively stable framework, shaped by classical texts and a limited set of known civilizations. That framework starts to fracture when excavations reveal structures and inscriptions that do not fit any recognized historical sequence. At first, these discoveries appear isolated, a set of unusually standardized stone foundations in one site, a cluster of administrative-style ceilings in another, fragments of writing that resemble known Bronze Age scripts but resist direct translation. Each discovery, taken alone, can be explained away as local variation or cultural borrowing, but as more sites are uncovered, a pattern begins to emerge that is too consistent to ignore. The turning point comes when multiple excavation teams begin independently identifying similar structural and administrative features across widely separated locations. Storage systems follow repeated architectural logic. Settlement layouts show standardized zoning principles. Inscription fragments, though incomplete, share recurring symbolic structures that suggest a unified system rather than isolated experimentation. The implication is unavoidable. These sites may belong to a single interconnected civilization that has not been properly recognized in historical synthesis. What makes this realization so disruptive is not just the scale, but the implications for established timelines. If these sites are part of a coherent system, then the Bronze Age world must be reconsidered as far more interconnected and administratively advanced than previously assumed. Civilizations once thought to be dominant in isolation now appear to have been part of a broader network of interaction, competition, and coordination that has not been fully reconstructed. One of the most significant breakthroughs occurs when inscriptions from different sites begin to align through comparative analysis. Patterns in symbol usage reveal consistent administrative syntax. Certain sequences appear repeatedly in contexts associated with storage, taxation, or resource allocation. While full translation remains incomplete, the structural consistency strongly suggests a bureaucratic language rather than purely ritual or decorative symbolism. At the same time, technological analysis of material remains reveals standardized production techniques across vast distances. Pottery composition, metalworking methods, and construction practices show unexpected uniformity. This level of standardization implies not only cultural contact, but systematic coordination or shared institutional frameworks. The likelihood of independent development producing such consistent results across regions is increasingly difficult to sustain. As these findings converge, scholars begin to revisit older excavation reports with new attention. Sites previously categorized as peripheral or culturally ambiguous are re-examined, and many begin to reveal overlooked connections. What was once interpreted as fragmentation or local idiosyncrasy now appears as parts of a larger pattern that was not previously recognized due to the absence of a unifying interpretive model. The rediscovery process is not straightforward. The evidence is often incomplete, damaged, or stratigraphically complex. Layers of occupation overlap, and later disturbances obscure earlier structures. In some cases, modern agricultural activity or urban development has partially destroyed key contexts. Despite these limitations, enough material survives to reconstruct a growing picture of a civilization whose scale and organization were previously underestimated. As the framework expands, attention turns once again to the question of historical absence. If such a civilization existed at this scale, why did it remain largely invisible in traditional historical narratives for so long? The answer appears increasingly tied to the earlier fragmentation of memory and transmission, the collapse of administrative continuity, combined with linguistic transformation and selective preservation, created conditions in which large portions of early history became effectively inaccessible to later record keepers. Another contributing factor is methodological. Earlier historical models tended to prioritize written records from well-known civilizations, while treating ambiguous or fragmentary evidence as peripheral. This approach, while practical at the time, had the unintended effect of reinforcing a narrow view of ancient history, only with more recent interdisciplinary methods combining archaeology, environmental science, and computational analysis has it become possible to recognize large-scale patterns that were previously invisible. Even so, the emerging picture remains incomplete. While the existence of a major interconnected system is increasingly supported by material evidence, its full structure, political organization, and historical trajectory are still under reconstruction. Many questions remain unresolved, including the exact nature of its governance, the full extent of its territory, and the precise sequence of its transformation and decline. What is becoming clear, however, is that the ancient world was far more complex than earlier narratives suggested. Instead of a series of isolated civilizations rising and falling independently, there appears to have been a deeply interconnected system of states and administrative networks, within which this forgotten superpower played a central role. Its rediscovery does not simply add another civilization to history. It reshapes the understanding of how ancient societies were structured, how information was preserved, and how entire systems of power can disappear not through annihilation, but through the gradual failure of interpretive continuity. The soil has not changed. The stones have not moved. What has changed is the ability to recognize what they were always preserving. As the accumulated evidence begins to coalesce, the boundaries of accepted Bronze Age history start to shift in subtle but irreversible ways. What once appeared to be isolated cultural centers now resolve into nodes within a wider system of interaction. The rediscovered civilization, long absent from traditional narratives, is no longer treated as an anomaly. It becomes part of a growing effort to reconstruct a more accurate map of ancient political and economic relationships. This process of reinterpretation is not immediate. It unfolds through incremental reassessment of familiar sites, where new analytical techniques reveal patterns that were previously invisible. High-resolution stratigraphic mapping exposes repeated architectural planning across distant regions. Isotopic analysis of materials confirms long-distance exchange of resources on a scale that exceeds earlier assumptions about Bronze Age connectivity, even seemingly minor artifacts. When viewed collectively, begin to form a coherent distribution network that points towards centralized coordination. The implications of these findings extend beyond archaeology. They challenge long-standing assumptions about how early complex societies develop. The traditional model, which emphasizes gradual regional evolution into isolated states, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of evidence suggesting widespread synchronization of administrative and technological systems. Instead, a more interconnected model emerges, one in which large-scale networks of influence may have formed earlier and operated more extensively than previously believed. Within this revised framework, the forgotten superpower is no longer an outlier, but a key structural component. Its administrative systems, once thought to be isolated discoveries in scattered excavation sites, are now understood as parts of a larger organizational framework that extended across multiple ecological and cultural zones. The consistency of symbolic systems across regions suggests not merely influence, but shared institutional foundations that shaped how governance and resource management were conducted over vast areas. At the same time, The reconstruction of this system raises new questions about historical transmission. If such a civilization played a central role in shaping regional development, why did its memory become so fragmented in later traditions? The answer appears increasingly tied to the mechanisms of knowledge loss rather than intentional removal. As administrative systems collapsed and linguistic continuity broke down, the capacity to preserve complex institutional memory diminished. What survived were simplified narratives, adapted to the needs of later societies rather than faithful to the structures they replaced. This reinterpretation also forces a reconsideration of what constitutes historical visibility. Civilizations are often defined by their presence in written records, but the emerging evidence suggests that material and systemic influence can persist, even when textual memory fades. Infrastructure, settlement patterns, and technological standardization can endure long after the original governing frameworks have disappeared. In this sense, the civilization was never fully absent. It was only rendered unreadable within the historical systems that came after it. As research deepens, attention shifts toward understanding the mechanisms that allowed such a large and complex system to function in the first place. The administrative coherence observed across distant regions suggests a level of coordination that required not only bureaucratic infrastructure but also shared conceptual frameworks. These may have included standardized education, codified legal systems, and widely recognized symbolic languages that enabled communication across cultural boundaries. Yet even as its former scale becomes clearer, signs of its eventual dissolution remain embedded in the record. Variability in later layers indicates increasing regional differentiation. Some areas show continued use of standardized systems, while others diverge into localized adaptations. This divergence suggests that the process of fragmentation did not occur uniformly, but unfolded unevenly, with different regions adapting to changing conditions at different rates. The broader Bronze Age world, once thought to be composed of relatively discrete civilizations, now appears as a more fluid and interconnected environment. Political boundaries were not fixed lines but shifting zones of influence, where administrative systems, trade networks, and cultural practices overlapped and interacted. Within this environment, the forgotten superpower emerges as a central organizing force whose influence extended beyond what earlier models could easily accommodate. However, the reconstruction remains incomplete. While the evidence strongly supports the existence of a large-scale integrated system, many aspects of its internal structure remain uncertain. The exact mechanisms of governance, the nature of its political authority, and the full extent of its territorial reach are still being pieced together from fragmentary data. Each new discovery refines the picture, but also introduces new complexities that resist simple resolution. What ultimately emerges from this process is not a single definitive narrative, but a shifting understanding of ancient history itself. The past is revealed not as a fixed sequence of known civilizations, but as a dynamic and partially obscured network of interactions, many of which were never fully preserved in later memory. The forgotten superpower, once absent from history, now occupies a central position in this revised understanding, not as a myth or anomaly, but as a reminder that what is missing from historical record is not necessarily what was unimportant, but what was lost in the long process of transmission, transformation, and forgetting. By the time the reconstruction reaches its most stable form, the forgotten superpower no longer exists as a single debated hypothesis, but as a layered convergence of evidence drawn from archaeology, environmental science, linguistics, and comparative ancient history. Yet even in this convergence, it remains strangely incomplete. It is present in fragments, patterns, and systems, but absent in the kind of singular narrative that later civilizations naturally produce about themselves. What is being uncovered is not just a lost state, but a missing structure in how the ancient world itself has been remembered. Across excavation sites, the same realization continues to return in different forms. No single ruin tells the full story. No single inscription explains the whole system. Instead, meaning emerges only when distant pieces are placed into relation with one another. A storage pattern in one region aligns with a symbolic sequence in another. A settlement layout echoes administrative zoning hundreds of kilometers away. Even environmental data begins to align with patterns of expansion, stress, and fragmentation that mirror the reconstructed timeline of the civilization's rise and dissolution. What becomes most striking is how deeply this system once shaped the behavior of the world around it, even in its absence from written memory. Trade routes, settlement patterns, and administrative conventions in later societies still carry traces of its structural logic, like echoes of a design that outlived its designers. The civilization does not survive as a name, but as a framework absorbed into the development of everything that followed it. Yet the absence of a clear historical identity continues to define its mystery. Without a preserved name, later civilizations could not easily anchor it within their own narratives. Without continuous records, its administrative complexity was reduced to scattered remnants, and without linguistic continuity, its internal logic became inaccessible to those who came later. Over time, it ceased to be recognized as a single entity, and instead dissolved into unrelated fragments of history, myth, and archaeology. This process reveals something broader about how civilizations are remembered. Historical survival is not only determined by size or influence, but by continuity of transmission. A civilization can shape regions, coordinate economies, and influence political systems, yet still disappear from memory if the mechanisms that preserve its record are disrupted. In this case, collapse did not simply end a system. It interrupted the chain through which that system could be understood. Even now, as modern reconstruction grows more sophisticated, there remains a sense of partial visibility. The civilization can be traced, mapped, and partially understood, but never fully reconstructed in its original lived coherence. It is always slightly out of reach, assembled from remnants that were never designed to be reassembled again. Each discovery adds clarity, but also reveals how much has already been irreversibly lost. And yet, the most important realization is not its disappearance, but its persistence. The structures it built, the systems it organized, and the patterns it introduced did not vanish with its administrative collapse. They were absorbed, adapted, and transformed by successor societies. In this sense, the civilization continues to exist, not as a political entity, but as an underlying layer in the development of later human history. As the perspective widens beyond the excavation sites and the reconstructed archives, the story becomes less about a single lost superpower and more about the fragility of historical visibility itself. Entire systems can exist in full complexity and still be reduced to fragments by the time they reach later memory. What survives is not always what was largest or most influential, but what was most continuously remembered. The ground that once buried this civilization remains unchanged. The stones still lie where they were placed, carrying inscriptions that only recently began to speak again. But what has changed is the ability to recognize that silence is not absence, it is interruption. And within that interruption lies the outline of a world that once operated at a scale and sophistication that history nearly forgot to see. In the end, the ancient superpower is neither fully lost nor fully recovered. It exists in a suspended state between evidence and memory, reconstructed but never complete, erased but never entirely gone. A reminder that history is not only what is preserved, but also what survives in fragments long after its name has faded from the world that once depended on it.